Well, let's speak now to Nabila Ramdani, journalist, writer, who wrote the brilliant book Fixing France, which is a really great read about the problems that France faces today. And you were on the Newsagents podcast a little while ago when there was unrest in the banlieue. It's great to have you back with us today. I wonder what you make of what Macron is doing and why.
Well, I think there is a great irony, and dare I say, a grim irony in what Macron is doing, because Macron effectively came in as, or presented himself as a bulwark against the National Rally. But his position has actually changed radically. And as we saw this week, he's now effectively relying on National Rally votes in Parliament. And even some of his own ministers are accusing him of governing with the National Rally. So there is no doubt that he's shifted to the right massively, and many are saying that he's now the enabler who will ensure a Le Pen president in 2027.
What do you make of the argument that I know Macron has posited, and I suppose his supporters would say, which is that he's doing this precisely to try and fend off the prospects of a National Rally presidency and that, or a far-right presidency, and that he's got to be seen to do something to counter the electorate's concerns around immigration, asylum, integration, and so on?
Well, I think there's a lot of clear reasons why extremist parties and why more mainstream ones, more central ones, more liberal ones like Macron's Renaissance Party are taking such a stance on issues such as immigration, which is always going to be a controversial and contentious issue because it's such a prominent matter across Europe at the moment. The cost of living crisis and the general feeling of impoverishment has made people feel pretty desperate, and they are looking for radical solutions. And I think Macron thinks he's offering that kind of solutions. And let's be honest, immigration has also become a huge media issue in very recent years, in a way it was never before. You even have myths and indeed conspiracy theories surrounding immigration, which are widespread. For example, some believe that immigrant communities will soon replace indigenous ones, and these are the kind of effectively ridiculous tropes that increase the far-right vote, and Macron is clearly tapping into that kind of extreme votes. But dare I say, I think France's problem is that it doesn't have sufficient mechanism to control the extremes. If you look at a country like Germany, for example, it works coalitions very well. The UK, for example, very successfully keeps extremists out of parliament. And you certainly wouldn't get 80 members of parliament or so from the far right in the House of Commons, as is the case in Paris now. So I think the very dangerous French presidential system allows a single individual like Marine Le Pen to take charge of the entire system with very few democratic checks and balances. And that's proven the case this week in Parliament. And Le Pen certainly thinks she can successfully play this system well enough to enter the Elysée in 2027.
Nabila, do you buy the new, softer focused, kinder, gentler, more compromising Marine Le Pen that she is trying to present to the French people?
No, I don't buy it for a second. I think she's very much a chip of the old bloc. Her messages is very straightforward and largely unchanged from the really ugly days of the National Front. And there are too many immigrants essentially in France, and that strict controls are needed. What has changed, however, I think, is the public mood. Xenophobia has gone mainstream, and far more French people think it is perfectly permissible to use discourse that discriminates against foreigners, and racism is on the rise, along with deep prejudice against religious minorities. I think what Marine Le Pen has tried to do with her national rally is try to turn it from a former one single issue of the National Front, meaning that its message was all about immigration, and immigration. But she clearly wants to widen her policy interests because she wants to be president of France, and she now has views about everything, including very parochial ones about the economy, such as making sure that 80% of food in school dinners is sourced in France, for example, which is a bit, wet as far as economic policies are concerned.
And just on the specifics of what Macron is proposing, about the limitations on migrants, about welfare benefits, about citizenship and all the rest of it. I just wonder what it means to you personally with North African heritage, but French. How does it make you feel?
Well, one of the aims of the new legislation is to introduce tough new measures, including quotas for immigrants and stricter conditions for residency permits. And that would mean stopping families like mine, for example, from bringing family members to France, from Algeria in my case. And that's often the nature of migration, to bring families together. There are also proposed clampdowns on getting health and other types of social security provisions, and effectively introducing a system of so-called national preference. Now, members of my family originally came over from Algeria to help rebuild French infrastructure, which by the 1970s and the 1980s were still in a very bad way following the horrific bombing during the Second World War. And now that would mean that immigrant construction workers, of which there are always many, are being threatened with deportation because it will become a lot harder for them to get permits to reside in France, let alone gain citizenship. In very practical terms, if I was born under this new legislation that's coming through in this package, I would certainly be discriminated against, meaning that if I was born to immigrant parents on French soil, I would not automatically become French. Now, my father was brought to help rebuild the country, so it seems, extremely unfair that his own children would now be threatened with deportation. And I think, France is built on immigration in the end. It has a huge amount of land borders, and it also created a vast colonial power across the world for centuries, so increasing the number of immigrants.
And Nabila, just finally, in terms of, could you just sum up how kind of France feels at the moment in terms of the kind of atmosphere of politics, the kind of pitch and tenor of politics, and how you're feeling about the years ahead? I mean, the next presidential election obviously is still some way away in 2027, but it certainly feels like it could potentially be an extremely important one.
Yes, indeed. And I think this immigration legislation sums it up, really, because it's a law that represents a blow to France's tradition of a land built on immigration. Far from building a cohesive society, this immigration law sums up France's rejection of differences, and it instead festers bigotry, suspicion, and indeed extremism. It effectively stigmatizes and it defies the huge contribution extremely hard-working immigrants have made in key sectors. So it's essentially a bill that's grounded in the small-town prejudices of Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National and not in France's ideological commitment to human rights.
Nabila, it's great to have you with us again. Thank you so much. Enjoy the holidays and meilleurs vœux pour la nouvelle année.
Merci infiniment to both of you.
Bye.
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 Bonne année.
So just two things that I was just thinking about there in terms of what Nabila was saying and what Peter was saying as well, which is that we made a whole show about it on the newsagents. I mean, I am concerned about the drift towards far-right rhetoric, towards the strengthening of far-right parties. The example you just mentioned, John, about Trump, America is always slightly further ahead of us. What he said was chilling to the blood and to the bone. I mean, it really was. And it sort of shows the extent to which we are the frogs in the boiling water, that we're not more shocked by this stuff now, that you could have a presidential candidate basically invoking that sort of rhetoric of fire and fury, pure far-right, and so on. I would say, though, that the centre-left and liberal forces and centrism more generally, it does have to have something to offer and to say to electorates that not just addresses their concerns, which is the kind of cliche, but also which shows that the centre has something to offer. I mean, one of the reasons that we're in this situation is because, and Nabila, to be fair to her, did just allude to it, we have had this series of profound economic crises, which has culminated in the cost of living crisis. And very often, the centre of politics, centre-left, centre-right, can seem exhausted intellectually, politically. and that it has little to say. And in that case, don't be surprised if electorates find themselves being gravitated towards people who, whatever you think of them, do have something to say. And that is just a challenge for 2024 in terms of how more centrist political forces or more traditional political forces approach politics and try and stem the flow of power towards these extremist forces.
I've always been struck by, when it comes to the debate, particularly about immigration, it's almost like, oh, this is rather uncomfortable. I don't really want to talk about this. And so you get mainstream politicians from the centre-left and from the centre-right sort of ducking the issue because they don't want to be branded as racist, they don't want to be stirring the pot, they don't want to upset the apple cart, whatever reason. But at a time when you have people on the right who want to make hay with this as an issue, for the centrist politicians to ignore it is a fatal mistake, and not to have a story to tell about the contribution, as we were hearing there from Nabila. Her father was brought over from Algeria to help rebuild France after the ravages of the Second World War. You know, the people that came into Britain because we needed to run the health service and we didn't have enough people to do it. There was a reason why patterns of migration happen.
And we're in a situation akin, not a million miles away from that now, in the sense that we do have ageing populations, we've got a post-COVID crisis, and we do have huge labour shortages across Western Europe. And I think you're right. Basically, there has got to be more centrist mainstream politicians have to find a way of articulating and addressing some of those concerns, whilst at the same time finding a different register and different story to tell about immigration and migration. Because, of course, if they do leave it entirely to the far right, then their tropes and their ideas are the ones that disseminate into mainstream politics. It is a really delicate balancing act, not to ape them, but to find your own way and language of addressing the issue and telling a different story. It's a challenge, but then again, why are they in politics if they don't want to challenge?